September 9, 1943, waters off the Gulf of Asinara near Sardinia. Dornier Do 217K-2 bombers from the German Luftwaffe Kampfgeschwader 100 Wiking squadron climbed to 18,000 feet carrying Fritz-X radio-guided armor-piercing bombs. Below them, the Italian battleship Roma leads a 17-ship fleet toward Malta to surrender to the Allies. One guided bomb will change naval warfare forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the Italian battleship Roma as Admiral Carlo Bergamini stood on the bridge, watching the Mediterranean stretch endlessly toward Malta. His flagship, all 46,000 tons of her, cut through the calm waters with the steady precision that had made the Littorio-class battleships the pride of the Regia Marina. Behind Roma sailed her sister ships Italia and Vittorio Veneto, flanked by 6 cruisers and 8 destroyers in a formation that would have struck fear into any enemy fleet just months earlier. Today, they sailed not to battle but to surrender. Bergamini clutched the coded message that had arrived from Admiral Raffaele de Courten, the Italian Navy minister, just hours before their departure from La Spezia. The armistice with the Allies had been signed in secret 3 days prior, though the announcement would not come until this evening. The fleet was to proceed immediately to Malta, where they would hand over the most powerful surface ships in the Mediterranean to the Royal Navy. It was a bitter pill for the veteran admiral who had spent 2 years watching Italy's naval power wither under constant Allied air attacks and fuel shortages. The irony was not lost on Bergamini that Roma herself had barely seen action since her commissioning in June 1942. Like her sister ships, she had spent most of the war anchored in various Italian ports, serving as a floating anti-aircraft battery while precious fuel reserves dwindled to nothing. The massive battleship had logged only 130 hours underway in her entire career, most of that spent relocating from one threatened harbor to another. Her 9 15-inch guns, capable of hurling 1,950-pound shells nearly 25 miles, had never fired at an enemy ship. In his private cabin that morning, Bergamini had reviewed the intelligence reports that painted a grim picture of Germany's response to the Italian armistice. Operation Axe was already underway, with German forces moving to disarm Italian troops throughout the peninsula. The Wehrmacht had anticipated this betrayal, as they saw it, and had prepared accordingly. What Bergamini did not know was that 200 miles away at the Istras airfield near Marseille, another kind of preparation was reaching its culmination. 19-year-old Lieutenant Klaus Dümling performed his final pre-flight checks on Dornier Do 217K-2 No. 4, his hands steady despite the magnitude of the mission ahead. This would be his first combat sortie, a fact that seemed almost surreal given the target they had been assigned. Suspended beneath the aircraft's wing pylons hung a single Fritz-X guided bomb, its cruciform tail fins and annular control surfaces giving it an appearance that was both elegant and menacing. The weapon weighed 3,450 pounds, with a 710-pound Amitol warhead designed to punch through the thickest naval armor ever built. Major Bernhard Jope had personally briefed the 12-man mission that morning, his weathered face betraying none of the uncertainty that must have gnawed at him. The Italian fleet had been spotted by reconnaissance aircraft at first light, steaming southwest from La Spezia at a steady 18 knots. Intelligence indicated they were bound for Malta to surrender, but Jope's orders were crystal clear. No Italian warships would be permitted to fall into Allied hands intact. The Fritz-X, barely a year in operational service, would write its name in history today. Dümling's bombardier, Oberstfreiter Hans Müller, ran through the guidance procedures one final time. The Kell-Strasbourg radio control system required absolute precision. Once the Fritz-X was released, Müller would have approximately 41 seconds to guide the bomb to its target using a small joystick connected to the FUG 203 transmitter. The bomb's Strasbourg receiver would respond to radio commands on one of 18 selectable frequencies between 482 and 499 MHz, adjusting the weapon's spoilers to alter its trajectory. A bright flare in the bomb's tail would allow Müller to track its descent visually, but this also meant the Do-217 would have to maintain a steady course throughout the weapon's flight, making them vulnerable to enemy fighters. The technical achievement represented by the Fritz-X was staggering for 1943. Dr. Max Kramer at the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt in Berlin-Adlershof had begun experimenting with radio-controlled bombs in 1938, initially working with 250-kilogram weapons. The Spanish Civil War had demonstrated the difficulty of hitting moving ships with conventional bombs, and Kramer's solution was revolutionary. By 1940, Rürstel AG had joined the development program, and the PC-1400 armor-piercing bomb had been selected as the foundation for the guided weapon. The Fritz-X that hung beneath Dümling's aircraft represented the culmination of thousands of hours of testing at Peenemünde and other Luftwaffe facilities. During trials, 50% of the weapons had landed within 14 meters of their targets when dropped from optimal altitude, with 100% falling within a 26-meter circle. The bomb could achieve transonic speeds of up to 767 miles per hour during its descent, generating enough kinetic energy to penetrate 28 inches of armor plating. No warship afloat, not even the mighty American Iowa-class battleships, could withstand such a blow. At 1,400 hours, the first wave of 6 Do-217K2 aircraft lifted off from Istria, each carrying a single Fritz-X. The second wave would follow shortly, but the primary attack would fall to this initial group. As they climbed toward their operational altitude of 18,000 feet, the pilots could see the French Mediterranean coast falling away beneath them. In 90 minutes, they would be over the Italian fleet. Aboard Roma, the first indication of danger came at 1,445 hours when Lookout spotted aircraft on the horizon. At this distance, the sleek Do-217s appeared as mere specks against the afternoon sky, but their presence was immediately reported to the bridge. Admiral Bergamini ordered an increase in speed to 20 knots and began evasive maneuvers, though the fleet's defensive options were severely limited. The Italian ships carried substantial anti-aircraft armaments, but their effective range was barely 10,000 meters. The German bombers would attack from well beyond that distance. Lieutenant Commander Raimondo Santagata, Roma's gunnery officer, watched the approaching aircraft through his binoculars and felt a chill of premonition. Something was different about their approach pattern. Instead of the typical diving attack or torpedo run, the Dorniers maintained their high altitude and steady course. Their behavior suggested a level bombing attack, which should have been ineffective against moving ships. What Santagata could not know was that he was witnessing the debut of guided precision weapons in naval warfare. The first Fritz-X was released at exactly 1,515 hours from an altitude of 18,500 feet. Oberstfreiter Müller watched the bomb separate from the aircraft and immediately began tracking its descent through the bomb's tail flare. The weapon fell like a meteor, its aerodynamic surfaces allowing precise control throughout its 41-second flight. Müller made minute adjustments with his joystick, the radio signals traveling to the Fritz-X's Strasbourg receiver and activating the spoiler systems that governed the bomb's trajectory. From the deck of Roma, the guided bomb appeared as a tiny point of light growing steadily larger. Seamen who had survived years of conventional air attacks stood transfixed as they realized this weapon was not following a ballistic trajectory. Instead, it seemed to be actively pursuing their ship, making subtle corrections that brought it inexorably toward the massive battleship superstructure. The first Fritz-X struck Roma's starboard side just aft of amidships at 1,545 hours. The 710-pound warhead, traveling at nearly 500 miles per hour, punched completely through the ship's 138-inch armor belt and 7 interior decks before detonating beneath the keel. The explosion sent a massive column of water skyward and immediately flooded Roma's after engine room and 2 boiler rooms. Electrical fires erupted throughout the stern section as seawater poured through the massive breach in the hull. The battleship's speed dropped from 20 knots to 12 knots as 2 of her 4 propeller shafts went offline. Admiral Bergamini, standing on Roma's bridge when the first bomb hit, felt the massive ship shudder beneath his feet. The explosion was unlike anything he had experienced in 2 years of war. This was not the sharp crack of a near miss or the thunderous detonation of a conventional bomb striking armor. This was something far more devastating, a precision strike that had found Roma's most vulnerable point with surgical accuracy. 7 minutes later, as damage control parties fought to contain the flooding and restore power, the second Fritz-X arrived. Lieutenant Dümling's bombardier had selected a different target point, aiming for the forward section of the battleship where Roma's main magazines were located. The second guided bomb struck between frames 123 and 136 on the starboard side, penetrating deep into the ship's vitals before detonating in the forward engine room. The explosion from the second Fritz-X was catastrophic beyond imagination. The bomb's blast ignited the magazines of Roma's No. 2 15-inch turret, creating a secondary explosion that could be seen for miles. The massive gun turret, weighing nearly 1,500 tons, was blown completely over the side by the force of the detonation. A mushroom cloud of smoke and debris rose 1,000 feet into the air as the battleship's forward section was torn apart by the blast. Capitano di Vascello Adun del Cima, Roma's commanding officer, knew immediately that his ship was doomed. The combination of catastrophic flooding, loss of power, and structural damage from the magazine explosion had broken Roma's back. The pride of the Italian Navy began listing heavily to starboard as thousands of tons of water poured through the massive holes torn in her hull. Within minutes, the list had increased to 20 degrees and was accelerating. Admiral Bergamini, realizing that Roma was beyond saving, gave the order to abandon ship at 1,602 hours. The evacuation was hampered by the battleship's severe list and the loss of electrical power, which had knocked out the ship's internal communications. Many sailors were trapped below decks as watertight doors became inoperable and escape routes were blocked by debris. As Roma capsized and broke in two, the sea around the sinking battleship was filled with hundreds of men struggling in the oil-slicked water. The destruction had been so rapid that many of the ship's lifeboats had been destroyed or rendered inaccessible. Nearby destroyers immediately began rescue operations, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed their capabilities. Of the 1,849 officers and men aboard Roma when she sailed from La Spezia that morning, only 596 would survive. Among the 1,253 casualties was Admiral Carlo Bergamini himself, along with approximately 200 members of his staff. The loss of the fleet commander at such a critical moment in Italian naval history was a blow from which the Regia Marina would never recover. While the rescue operations continued around Roma's grave, the remaining ships of the Italian fleet pressed on toward Malta, their commanders sobered by the devastating demonstration of German guided weapon technology. Italia, Roma's sister ship, had also been struck by a Fritz-X during the attack, but the bomb had passed completely through the ship before exploding underwater. Though damaged and taking on water, Italia remained afloat and operational. The sinking of Roma represented the first successful combat use of a precision-guided munition against a major warship. The Fritz-X had achieved what conventional bombing had failed to accomplish throughout the war, the destruction of a heavily armored capital ship by air attack alone. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. For the German aircrew returning to Istria, the mission had been an unqualified success, but there was little celebration. Lieutenant Dumling later wrote that the sight of the mighty battleship breaking apart beneath the waves left him with mixed emotions. Roma had been a beautiful ship, a masterpiece of naval engineering, and her destruction marked the end of an era in Mediterranean naval warfare. The success of the Fritz-X attack on the Italian fleet was rapidly communicated to the highest levels of the German command structure. Adolf Hitler himself was briefed on the operation, and orders were immediately issued to expand the guided weapons program. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated that even the most powerful enemy warships could be destroyed by precision weapons launched from beyond the range of defensive fire. But the Fritz-X program faced severe constraints that would ultimately limit its strategic impact. Rheinmetall Borsig, the primary manufacturer, had planned to produce 750 guided bombs per month, but actual production never approached this target. Between April 1943 and the program's termination in December 1944, only 1,386 Fritz-X weapons were completed. Of these, 602 were expended in training and testing, leaving fewer than 800 available for combat operations. The specialized aircrew training required for Fritz-X operations was another limiting factor. 3/KG-100, the only Luftwaffe unit equipped with the guided weapons, had received intensive instruction during May and June 1943 at Schwabisch Hall. The complexity of the radio guidance system meant that only highly trained bombardiers could effectively employ the weapon, and replacing losses was difficult given the demanding training requirements. Moreover, the tactical limitations of the Fritz-X system became increasingly apparent as Allied countermeasures evolved. The requirement for the launch aircraft to maintain a steady course during the bomb's flight made the Do-217 vulnerable to fighter attack. The visual tracking system meant that operations were limited by weather and visibility conditions. Most critically, the radio control link proved susceptible to jamming once the Allies understood how the system operated. The intelligence windfall from captured Fritz-X components would prove decisive in developing countermeasures. At Anzio in early 1944, Allied forces recovered an intact Henschel HS-293 guided missile, providing detailed information about the Kehl-Strasbourg control system. Around the same time, a crashed Heinkel He-177 on Corsica yielded complete transmitter components, allowing Allied technicians to understand exactly how the German guidance system operated. The British Type 650 jammer, deployed in early 1944, proved particularly effective against the Fritz-X. Unlike earlier jamming systems that attempted to block specific radio frequencies, the Type 650 targeted the intermediate frequency section of the Strasbourg receiver at 3 MHz. This approach automatically defeated the guided weapons regardless of which of the 18 command frequencies was selected, making it impossible for German operators to simply switch to an unjammed channel. The electronic warfare battle that developed around the Fritz-X represented the first sustained combat between guided weapons and countermeasures. The Germans attempted to counter Allied jamming by developing wire-guided versions of their weapons, using dual cable reels to extend control range up to 12 kilometers. More exotic solutions included the radiation passive radar homing system, which could home in on Allied radar emissions, but these advanced variants never reached operational status. By the time of the Normandy landings in June 1944, the combination of Allied air superiority and electronic countermeasures had effectively neutralized the Fritz-X threat. Approximately 125 guided bombs were expended against the invasion fleet with negligible results. The Do-217s of 3/KG-100 were forced to operate at extreme altitude to avoid Allied fighters, reducing the accuracy of their weapons, while shipborne jammers disrupted the guidance systems of those bombs that were successfully launched. The final operational use of Fritz-X weapons came in August 1944 during the attempted destruction of bridges over the Sea and Saloon rivers in Normandy. 3/KG-100 launched its remaining dozen serviceable aircraft in a desperate attempt to slow the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead. 7 aircraft were lost in the mission, while only a single bridge was slightly damaged. The attack marked the end of the Fritz-X as an effective weapon system. Despite its limited operational success, the Fritz-X had demonstrated principles that would revolutionize modern warfare. The concept of precision-guided munitions would evolve through the Cold War into the sophisticated weapons systems that dominated conflicts from Vietnam through the present day. The electronic warfare techniques developed to counter the Fritz-X established doctrines that remain relevant in contemporary military operations. For the Italian Navy, the loss of Roma represented far more than the destruction of a single ship. The psychological impact of watching their most powerful warship destroyed by a weapon they could neither understand nor counter marked the end of Italy's naval ambitions. The remaining Italian battleships would spend the rest of the war interned in Egypt, their crews eventually joining the Allied cause but never again threatening German control of the Mediterranean. The technical analysis of the Fritz-X attack revealed the fundamental vulnerability of surface ships to precision air attack. Roma's 13.8-inch armor belt, designed to resist the heaviest naval gunfire, had been penetrated with ease by a weapon that weighed less than 2 tons. The guided bomb's kinetic energy, generated by its 18,000-foot drop and transonic speed, had proven more than sufficient to defeat even the most sophisticated armor schemes. The human cost of the Fritz-X program extended far beyond the casualties inflicted on enemy forces. The German guided weapons industry relied heavily on forced labor, including Eastern European workers and concentration camp prisoners. At the Rheinmetall-Borsig facilities in Dusseldorf and Berlin-Tegel, thousands of foreign workers assembled the precision components that made the Fritz-X possible. The Unterlüss proving grounds, where many of the weapons were tested, displaced German farming families whose land was requisitioned for the expanding military complex. Dr. Max Kramer, the brilliant engineer whose innovations had made the Fritz-X possible, continued his research throughout the war despite the program's declining effectiveness. His team at the Deutsche Versuchsanstalt für Luftfahrt pursued increasingly exotic guidance concepts, including infrared homing systems and television guidance. The X-2 prototype had been designed for 700 mph speeds and infrared terminal guidance, but only one example was completed before the concept was abandoned as too complex. The X-3 variant promised even greater performance, with supersonic speeds up to 900 mph and a maximum range of 7 miles. This advanced design would have been far more difficult to intercept and jam, but the deteriorating German industrial situation made its development impossible. By 1944, the Reich Ministry of Aviation was focused on simpler weapons that could be produced quickly with limited resources. The Allied intelligence community's response to the Fritz-X threat demonstrated the importance of technical intelligence in modern warfare. The capture of German guidance systems at Anzio and Corsica had provided the detailed information necessary to develop effective countermeasures. The speed with which British and American engineers produced jamming systems revealed the industrial and technological advantages that would ultimately decide the war's outcome. The broader implications of the Fritz-X program extended well beyond its immediate military applications. The weapon represented Germany's attempt to leverage technological superiority to compensate for declining resources and manpower. As the war progressed and Germany's conventional forces were increasingly outnumbered, wonder weapons like the Fritz-X, V-1 flying bomb, and V-2 ballistic missile offered the promise of achieving decisive results with limited resources. However, the Fritz-X also illustrated the limitations of technological solutions to strategic problems. Despite its technical sophistication and tactical effectiveness, the guided bomb could not address the fundamental weaknesses in Germany's position by 1943. The limited production numbers, training requirements, and vulnerability to countermeasures meant that even the most successful precision weapon could not alter the war's trajectory. The legacy of the Fritz-X extends far beyond its wartime applications. The precision-guided munitions that dominated the 1991 Gulf War, the 1999 Kosovo conflict, and subsequent military operations can trace their conceptual origins to Dr. Kramer's pioneering work in the 1940s. The television-guided bombs, laser-guided missiles, and GPS-directed weapons of the modern era all employ the same basic principle demonstrated by the Fritz-X, the ability to guide a weapon to its target with unprecedented accuracy. The electronic warfare techniques developed to counter the Fritz-X also establish principles that remain relevant today. The cat-and-mouse game between guidance systems and countermeasures that began in the Mediterranean in 1943 continues in modern conflicts, where electronic jamming, spoofing, and deception play critical roles in determining the effectiveness of precision weapons. For naval warfare specifically, the Fritz-X attack on Roma marked a turning point in the balance between aircraft and ships. The vulnerability of even the most heavily armored vessels to precision air attack had been conclusively demonstrated. This lesson would influence naval design and doctrine throughout the Cold War, leading to the development of sophisticated air defense systems and the gradual abandonment of traditional gun-armed battleships in favor of missile-equipped destroyers and cruisers. The industrial history of the Fritz-X program also provides insights into the German war economy's increasing desperation by 1943. The gap between planned production targets and actual manufacturing output reflected broader problems with resource allocation, labor supply, and industrial organization. The reliance on forced labor, while providing temporary solutions to manpower shortages, ultimately undermined the quality and reliability of German weapons systems. The international dimensions of the Fritz-X program highlight the global nature of technological competition during World War II. German attempts to share guided weapons technology with Japan through the Yanagi submarine missions represented early examples of international arms cooperation. The 2 tons of gold transported by submarine I-29 to pay for German technology demonstrated the value both nations placed on precision weapons development. The post-war fate of Fritz-X technology illustrates the rapid pace of technological transfer following Germany's defeat. Both Soviet and American intelligence teams competed to capture German weapons specialists and technical documentation. Dr. Kramer and other DVL personnel were eventually recruited into American missile programs, where their expertise contributed to the development of early guided weapons for the U.S. military. The Soviet Union, having captured intact Fritz-X weapons and technical documentation, immediately began experimenting with infrared guidance systems and other improvements. The rapid Soviet development of anti-ship missiles during the early Cold War period drew heavily on German precision weapons technology captured in 1945. For the families of the men lost aboard Roma, the technical achievements and historical significance of the Fritz-X offered little consolation. The 1,253 Italian sailors who died when their flagship sank represented a human cost that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Many were young men conscripted from fishing villages and farming communities throughout Italy, men who had joined the navy seeking steady employment rather than military glory. Admiral Bergamini's decision to sail Roma and her consorts to Malta rather than scuttling them in La Spezia reflected the complex political situation facing Italian military leaders in September 1943. The armistice negotiations had been conducted in such secrecy that even senior commanders were uncertain about the terms and their implications. Bergamini's choice to preserve the fleet for post-war Italy ultimately cost him his life, but it also demonstrated the professionalism and dedication that characterized the best elements of the Regia Marina. The technical specifications of the Fritz-X continue to impress modern weapons designers. The bomb's 28-inch armor penetration capability exceeded that of many contemporary naval guns, while its accuracy during testing approached that of modern precision weapons. The 20% hit rate achieved in combat conditions, while disappointing to German commanders, compared favorably to the accuracy of conventional bombing attacks against moving ships. The Kell-Strasbourg guidance system, despite its vulnerabilities to jamming, represented a remarkable achievement for 1940s technology. The ability to transmit precise control commands over distances of several miles using vacuum tube electronics required innovations in radio frequency design and antenna engineering. The integration of the guidance antennas into the Fritz-X's tail fin structure demonstrated the attention to aerodynamic detail that characterized the best German engineering. The human element in Fritz-X operations proved as critical as the technical systems. The bombardiers who guided the weapons to their targets required exceptional skill and composure under combat conditions. Operating a joystick control system while their aircraft maneuvered to avoid enemy fire, tracking a tiny flare through binoculars, and making split-second corrections demanded abilities that few aircrews possessed. Lieutenant Dumling's account of the Roma attack provides rare insights into the psychological pressures faced by Fritz-X operators. The 19-year-old pilot's description of watching Roma break apart beneath the waves reveals the emotional complexity of employing weapons that could destroy with unprecedented precision. The abstract nature of radio-guided bombing, with its emphasis on technical proficiency over traditional combat skills, foreshadowed the evolution of warfare toward increasingly remote and automated systems. The broader strategic context of the Fritz-X program reflects Germany's desperate attempt to develop war-winning technologies as its conventional forces faced increasing pressure on multiple fronts. By 1943, the Wehrmacht was fighting a three-front war against opponents whose industrial capacity far exceeded Germany's own. Precision weapons like the Fritz-X offered the possibility of achieving decisive results with limited resources, but they also represented a dangerous diversion of scarce technical talent and manufacturing capacity. The allocation of resources to guided weapons development while German forces lacked adequate supplies of conventional ammunition and fuel revealed the Reich leadership's misunderstanding of their strategic situation. The 1,386 Fritz-X weapons produced during the program's existence represented thousands of hours of skilled labor and substantial quantities of rare materials that might have been better employed in other applications. Nevertheless, the Fritz-X program's contributions to military technology cannot be dismissed. The precision-guided munitions that have dominated recent conflicts owe their conceptual origins to the pioneering work conducted in German laboratories and testing facilities during the early 1940s. The guidance principles, aerodynamic solutions, and tactical employment methods developed for the Fritz-X established foundations that continue to influence modern weapons design. The electronic warfare legacy of the Fritz-X extends beyond its immediate applications to encompass the entire spectrum of modern military communications and guidance systems. The jamming techniques developed to counter German guided weapons evolved into the sophisticated electronic countermeasures that protect contemporary military forces from precision attack. The continuous cycle of measure and countermeasure that began with the Fritz-X continues to drive innovation in both offensive weapons and defensive systems. As the Mediterranean sun set on September 9, 1943, The debris field marking Roma's grave spread across several miles of sea. The battleship's massive hull had broken completely in two, with the forward section sinking immediately while the stern remained partially afloat for several more hours. Italian destroyers continued their rescue efforts throughout the night, pulling exhausted survivors from the oil-covered water while the remainder of the fleet pressed on toward Malta. The strategic implications of Roma's loss extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The successful demonstration of precision-guided weapons technology had fundamentally altered the balance of naval warfare, proving that even the most heavily protected ships could be destroyed by relatively small numbers of specially equipped aircraft. This lesson would influence naval planning and ship design throughout the remainder of the war and well into the post-war period. For Germany, the Fritz-X attack represented both a technological triumph and a strategic failure. While the guided weapon had achieved its immediate objective of preventing Italian warships from joining the Allied fleet, the broader goal of maintaining German control over the Mediterranean was already lost. The success of the Fritz-X could not compensate for the fundamental weaknesses in Germany's strategic position by late 1943. The Italian armistice, announced just hours after Roma's sinking, marked the beginning of the end for Axis control of southern Europe. The loss of Italian ports, airfields, and naval facilities would severely constrain German operations in the Mediterranean, while the addition of Italian forces to the Allied cause provided valuable manpower and local knowledge for the coming campaigns. The human stories behind the Fritz-X program reveal the complex moral landscape of technological warfare. Dr. Kramer and his engineering team had created a weapon of unprecedented precision and effectiveness, but they had also enabled the destruction of a ship carrying nearly 2,000 men. The German aircrew who delivered the fatal blows were following orders in what they believed was a legitimate military operation, yet their success resulted in one of the war's most devastating single-ship losses. The Italian sailors aboard Roma had been sailing to surrender when they were attacked by their former allies, adding an element of tragic irony to their fate. Many had volunteered for naval service believing they would serve their country honorably, only to find themselves caught in the complex political and military currents that would ultimately destroy fascist Italy. The technological competition that produced the Fritz-X reflected broader patterns of innovation and adaptation that characterized World War II. The unprecedented pace of weapons development, driven by the existential nature of the conflict, produced advances in electronics, aerodynamics, and precision engineering that would influence civilian technology for decades. The same innovations that made precision-guided weapons possible also contributed to post-war developments in aviation, communications, and manufacturing. The Fritz-X program's documentation, preserved in archives and technical reports, continues to provide insights into the weapons development process under extreme pressure. The detailed engineering drawings, test reports, and operational analyses reveal both the remarkable achievements and the fundamental limitations of wartime research and development. These historical records serve as valuable case studies for modern defense planners facing similar challenges of balancing innovation with practical constraints. The environmental and social costs of Fritz-X development, while secondary to the military considerations of the time, provide sobering reminders of warfare's broader impacts. The industrial facilities that produced the guided weapons relied on forced labor and contributed to environmental degradation that persisted long after the war's end. The displacement of civilian populations to create testing ranges and manufacturing sites demonstrated the total nature of the conflict and its effects on non-combatant populations. As historians continue to analyze the Fritz-X program and its implications, new perspectives emerge on the relationship between technology and warfare. The precision-guided weapon represents an early example of the computerization of conflict, with electronic systems replacing human judgment in critical decisions. This evolution toward automated warfare, begun with the Fritz-X, continues to raise fundamental questions about the nature of combat and the role of human agency in life and death decisions. The Mediterranean waters that witnessed Roma's final moments have long since erased the visible traces of that September afternoon in 1943. The oil slicks have dispersed, the debris has settled to the seafloor, and the exact location of the battleship's grave remains marked only by the coordinates recorded in naval histories. Yet the invisible legacy of the Fritz-X attack continues to influence military planning and technological development more than 80 years later. The precision-guided munitions that dominated the opening hours of Operation Desert Storm in 1991, striking Iraqi targets with television-guided accuracy, employed principles first demonstrated over the waters off Sardinia. The electronic countermeasures that protect modern military forces from guided weapons trace their origins to the jamming systems developed to counter the Fritz-X. The strategic competition between offensive precision and defensive countermeasures that characterizes contemporary military affairs began with Dr. Kramer's radio-controlled bomb and the Allied response to its devastating effectiveness. For the families of Admiral Bergamini and the 1,252 other Italian sailors lost with Roma, the historical significance of the Fritz-X attack provides little comfort. Their loved ones died in what may have been the first precision-guided weapons attack in naval history, but they died nonetheless, victims of a technology that promised to make warfare more efficient while making it no less deadly. The human cost of technological progress in warfare remains as relevant today as it was on that clear September afternoon when the Italian Navy learned that the age of precision-guided warfare had begun. The Fritz-X had spoken, and naval warfare would never be the same.